right, welcome everybody to this special presentation where we've been focusing over the past weeks on the symposium of the American system. What was it? What made America good and not suck at the best of times? What were those presidents doing who tended to get assassinated while they were in office? That's been sort of the subtle theme running through the previous lectures. And we're at a point right now of serious choices that are being made over whether or not humanity is fit to survive or not. Huge rifts are happening, disruptions from patterns that we got a little bit too complacent and used to over the past generations, for good and for bad. And obviously, there's a lot we don't know. A lot of decisions have been made in back rooms outside of the public ear. But that being said, it doesn't mean we can't develop educated hypotheses. And thus, I felt who better to contribute some of their insights into where things are going right now. I mean, we all saw the famous video of Zelensky getting torn down in the White House and effectively, leaving in shame and embarrassment, which is a nice thing to see. There's some good and very good ideas, I think, that are in play right now that recognize that nuclear war is not an expedient option and something that involves a retooling, a revival of a pro-industrial paradigm is preferable, maybe one that's vectored around cooperation with nations that have formerly been targeted as enemies. On the other hand, we have some very, very, very terrible ideas that are still in play, which shouldn't be ignored. And I think Joaquin is somebody who looks at the good and the bad and the ugly simultaneously. And so he agreed to showcase some of those insights. And like usual, after Joaquin's formal remarks and considerations, we'll open up for a little bit of a dialogue with the audience and see how that goes. And Joaquin, thank you for doing this, man. And it's all yours.
Oh, thanks for having me. Some little adjustments here on my technical end.
Yep.
Yeah, there's as you were saying, the particular part of your introductory comments when you were talking about systems that have been arranged in such ways, or the one that we have now that pits parts of the world on collision paths, where in fact, as you say, I think there's a lot of support behind what you're saying as well, that actually there can be a lot of cooperation, space for a lot of cooperation. So that was actually one of the things that kind of came out last week in headlines for people that were listening a lot to John Mearsheimer, especially at the beginning of the conflict, who appears as like a strong critic of Biden, but it's a very nuanced criticism, and he definitely is of the belief that the crisis in Ukraine, that Putin did not have to go in, right? And that is an area of profound disagreement that I have with Mearsheimer. So that's like a kind of framing idea. In his main idea, his main contribution to the field of realism is a branch of one of the disciplines of subcategories within realism, which is called neo-realism, and his is called offensive realism. No offense. And what offensive realism, I believe, makes a very critical mistake because it projects the thinking of his own parent. It's like one of the biggest errors also made in anthropology, in social anthropology or comparative anthropology, where the actual subject projects onto the subject that they're studying their own biases and prejudices and sort of outlook onto the other. So Mearsheimer begins, or you can say he concludes in one area and then uses that, so I'm not saying it's a false premise, but he begins with the conclusion, which becomes the premise for his further ideas, that any power will seek to maximize its power, any power in the world will necessarily seek to maximize its power in the world to the fullest extent possible at any given time. And that I think that's the mantra be false, first of all. But it is also a problem because if he's ascribing this to be within the domain of rational decision making, you see, if you put this grand strategy and you project that onto some other power and you say this is how they're going to behave if they're behaving rationally, well, we have a problem because rational decision making might not lead to that outcome. You know, someone that was power mad, or a country that had somehow in its history and in the development of wrong ideas associated maximum power, or they defined power in terms of power over, in terms as opposed to collaborative or sustainable in terms of long term. This is not a minor point. We're really talking about how we've had centuries now of data that show us so many things about the rise and the fall of the Spanish Empire, the rise and the fall of the Portuguese Empire, the rise and the fall of the British Empire, now the rise and the fall of the American Empire, and so on. So one of the most understood phenomenon, and you guys are thinking it all right now too, probably, is what? Overstretch, overreach, imperial overreach. So now, if you can think this, you know, people, this has been a train of thought for some, this has been a criticism of empire for some time. And it's, but the point is that planners in imperial projects have an awareness of the extent to which they then might not have the right calculation, but the phenomenon is not an alien one to contemplate, that there are limits after which there may be a vacuum and you may be able to push for more power, but what's going to happen in 10 years or 30 years in terms of creating long-term endemic disbalances in world power? So in other words, what's it going to cause other countries to do later on? So the other thing Mersheimer said was that the Russians would never go into Ukraine because it would become an Afghanistan for them. And we pointed that out at the time, that that was an error, and that it's an interesting thing to consider as a thought experiment. I mean, it's not, you know, wrong to say, hey, what if it's a quagmire and stuff? But I think you could work through that question, and his result is not obvious. So the things that we saw last week, I really, really hope that everyone saw it. Is it possible to, I think this is a very important moment in time where a lot of fake news, most people have only seen 1 minute clips or 2 minute clips or something out of order. I have here, can I somehow do a screen share and, you know, of the 10-minute? I'd like to run it, and then I want to share my notes with you about why, in fact, the deal with the British cap, you know, is being done now, what was happening before, and then, you know, we can deconstruct actually what the crisis was. So
sure. Do you want me to play it, or do you want to play it on your end?
Yeah, like I have it say, like I understand that it can play cleanest if you play it off of your hard drive instead of off of like an online source.
Oh yeah. Well, you have screen sharing powers, so if you want to,
yeah, I'm gonna see if it's possible to share.
If not, I can run it off of YouTube and hope for the best if you have issues. But just be sure you hit share sound when you do the screen share, because that's what.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if. Okay, so let me see if I can see what I can do here.
All right.
I think first you have to start the program.
So you have to open it first on your desktop. That's right. And then once
so that Zoom can recognize it as a program that's on.
Yeah, exactly.
and then I go, dude, help me out. Oh, share.
Yeah, and do make sure share sound is clicked in the Zoom thing.
Perfect. So then I just hit share, right? Are people
Yeah,
see?
yeah, it's working.
For them.
We see, yeah, it's good.
Well, if I didn't align myself with both of them, you'd never have a deal. You want me to say really terrible things about Putin and then say, "Hi, Vladimir, how are we doing on the deal?" That doesn't work that way. I'm not aligned with Putin. I'm not aligned with anybody. I'm aligned with the United States of America and for the good of the world. I'm aligned with the world, and I want to get this thing over with. You see the hatred he's got for Putin. It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate. He's got tremendous hatred, and I understand that, but I can tell you the other side isn't exactly in love with, you know, him either. So it's not a question of alignment. I'm aligned with the world. I want to get the thing set. I'm aligned with Europe. I want to see if we can get this thing done. You want me to be tough? I could be tougher than any human being you've ever seen. I'd be so tough. But you're never going to get a deal that way. So that's the way it goes. All right, one more question.
I will respond to this. So look, for 4 years in the United States of America, we had a president who stood up at press conferences and talked tough about Vladimir Putin, and then Putin invaded Ukraine and destroyed a significant chunk of the country. The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy. We tried the pathway of Joe Biden of thumping our chest and pretending that the President of the United States' words mattered more than the President of the United States' actions. What makes America a good country is America engaging in diplomacy. That's what President Trump is doing.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now the President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact line?
2015.
2014.
2014 and 2015.
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
That's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, yeah, the situation the same. The people are been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him, a lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him, me, like a new president. In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed with him with gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You
God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly
Remember
what
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very
You
strong.
will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the
the
cards right now. With us, you start having
not
cards.
playing
But
cards.
right now, you don't.
Very
Yeah, you're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're
I'm
gambling
the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War III.
What do you think
You're
about?
gambling with
What do you
World
think
War
about?
III. And
You-
what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's
with
back
all
to you.
respect to your
Far
country.
more than a lot of people said
very
they
respect.
should have.
Have you said thank you once this
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting, have
today.
you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of
are you
America
speaking about?
and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not
Yeah.
speaking loudly. Your country's
Can I-
in big
can-
trouble.
can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No.
Can
You've
I
done a lot
answer?
of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not
I
winning.
know.
You're not winning this.
I...
You have a damn
We-
good chance of
we are
coming out
staying,
okay because of
Mr.
us.
President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
You haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this
We
cabinet.
gave you, through
I
this
said thank
stupid
you.
president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military equipment,
You
and your
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
Yes. What about
if you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me-
equipment,
you invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak-
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3
okay?
days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course,
It's
yes.
going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I
Again,
tell
you
you.
just say thank you.
I said a lot of
except
times
that
thank
there,
you
except
to
that,
American people.
except that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on
I
over
understand,
there.
sir.
I think it's
I
very
understand.
important. That's why I kept this going so long. You have to be thankful. You don't have the
I'm
cards.
thankful.
You're buried there. Your people are dying.
tell you
You're
again,
running low
I know.
on soldiers.
Don't-
Listen,
don't please,
you're running
Mr.
low on
President.
soldiers. It would be a damn good thing.
Mr.
And then
President.
then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire. I want to go and I want this. Look, if you could get a ceasefire right now, I tell you, you take it so the bullets stop flying and your men stop getting killed.
Of course, we want to stop the war.
But you're saying you don't want a ceasefire.
But I said to you,
I want a ceasefire.
with guarantees.
Because you'll get a ceasefire faster than an agreement.
Ask our people about ceasefire, what they think.
That wasn't
doesn't
with
matter
me.
for you what-
that
what
wasn't
this
with me.
means. It
That was
wasn't
with
with you.
a guy named Biden, who was not a smart person.
But this
That
is
was
your,
with,
this
that was
is
with
your
Obama.
president. It was your president.
Excuse me. That was with Obama, who gave you sheets, and I gave you javelins.
Yes.
I gave you the javelins to take out all those tanks. Obama gave you sheets. In fact, the statement is Obama gave sheets and Trump gave javelins. You got to be more thankful, because let me tell you, you don't have the cards. With us, you have the cards. But without us, you don't have any cards.
One more question to Mr. Vice President. I'm sorry, here.
It's going to be a tough deal to make,
Um,
because the attitudes have to change.
what if Russia breaks ceasefire? What if Russia breaks peace talks? What do you do then? I understand that it's a heated conversation right now.
What are you
but
saying?
what if
She's asking, what if Russia
Putin
breaks the
breaks
ceasefire?
for the-
What if anything? What if a bomb drops on your head right now?
But they have
Okay?
broken
What if they
ceasefire
broke it?
many
I don't know. They broke it with Biden because Biden, they didn't respect him. They didn't respect Obama. They respect me.
But all-
Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia. Russia. You ever hear of that deal? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam. Hillary Clinton, Shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through it. We didn't end up in a war. And he went through it. He was accused of all that stuff. He had nothing to do with it. It came out of Hunter Biden's bathroom. It came out of Hunter Biden's bedroom. It was disgusting. And then they said, oh, the laptop from hell was made by Russia, the 51 agents. The whole thing was a scam. And he had to put up with that. He was being accused of all that stuff. All I can say is this. He might have broken deals with Obama and Bush, And he might have broken them with Biden. He did, maybe. Maybe he didn't. I don't know what happened. But he didn't break them with me. He wants to make a deal. I don't know if you can make a deal. The problem is, I've empowered you to be a tough guy. And I don't think you'd be a tough guy without the United States. And your people are very brave. But you're either going to make a deal or we're out. And if we're out, you'll fight it out. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but you'll fight it out. But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing. All right, I think we've seen enough. What do you think? Huh? This is going to be great television, I will say that. All right, we'll see what we can do about putting it together. Thank you.
Oh, Joaquin?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't hear you there for a second. You're back.
Well, as I said at the time, great moments in history, and looking at the body language of Zelensky, he was having a meltdown. And there was another angle that we didn't see that was a broader angle from the side, and it showed his, parts of his team. And he has one of his advisors, I forget her name, and she had her head in her hand, and she just, at a certain point, there were other shots that we couldn't see her.
Oh yeah, that was the ambassador. That was the ambassador.
Yeah, that's it. That's him. Yeah,
Washington.
There's other parts that we couldn't see her, but I just imagine she was like, I mean, she must have just been losing it. But there's evidence that that he was told to push the question of the ceasefire, even though the ceasefire is not technically part of this deal that they were supposed to sign, but then didn't sign. And that's how it ended, was with a non-signing. And then Zelensky was asked to leave the White House, and they didn't have the signing, they didn't have the luncheon, and they didn't have the joint press conference. The two men were going to stand, I suppose, somewhat disproportionately, side by side in front of the podiums. I don't know how they were going to do Zelensky's, but they were going to be there, and they were going to, talk about what they had just signed. So those three events didn't transpire after this conversation, but as people have been talking about, and people have seen, in January, the British announced a secret agreement with Zelensky. This was around early January. In the first week of January. And it was meant, newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post at the time wrote that these were efforts to Trump-proof the change of administration, or to Trump-proof rather the Ukraine effort. So that was a secret agreement. Now, very interestingly, is that then later, around forgive me, I had it here. Yes, later, on Wednesday, February 5th, let me share the link with you guys here. Thank you, Martin. Let me share the link here with you guys in the, I don't need to share a document, just in the chat. Sorry, here we go. There it is. So, this is from the parliament.uk government, UK government website. So this is about the UK-Ukraine 100-year partnership agreement, right? You guys can see it there if you guys have the link from the chat. It's not necessary to open the link, but oh, thanks. Wonderful. So you can see that as they began just talking about what types of agreements they had in force before going into it. And then there were, if you scroll down, you'll see that the issue of economic development is the category to get sort of down to the nitty gritty. You'll see economy, trade, scientific, and you can see a critical mineral strategy right there. You have green steel, renewable energy, and critical minerals. Anyway, so let's go broad a little bit. You have this document here, but let's just like sort of think about these different news items. Like Ukraine made a statement around this time that the frozen Russian assets belong to Ukraine. So this was sort of, it seemed like it was said out of the blue with relation to a few other developments concurrent, of course, but I believe if we think about that element of the story, it will reveal something very interesting. Why is that? Because this whole time the EU has, within the framework of the EU, not developed a legal strategy to make use of these frozen Russian assets. And it's, on the face of it, just ludicrous for Ukraine to assert that it's theirs. But we are talking about the EU and what they would justify and how they might think about this. So what if they simply began their legal procedure on the foundation that the assets actually were Ukrainian, without litigating or giving them to Ukraine? Now, mind you, up until now, the strategy has been, how can we make this something that we are going to freeze and then use maybe the dividends from, or use maybe interest accrued from, we can maybe spend interest that has accrued on this, or things like this. There's other schemes that have been kind of lukewarm versions of taking Russia's money that we have heard in the past year or two on this. So this would be very interesting. What if it was just, let's just build everything on this foundation that it belongs to Ukraine. After all, we can say things like this right now. Now, I'm not talking about what people are going to do, but maybe they will try, but they're angling to say things like this right now. Very soon, as you get what has happened with this, now Zelensky met with European leaders again. This is of course, on one level, everyone can see that it's a face-saving PR stunt to show solidarity for Zelensky in the face of many saying, oh, is Zelensky out? I mean, the Washington Post and New York Times have already had different opinion pieces speculating that something like this would be forthcoming pretty soon in the aftermath of what we saw go down in this clip here. So that said, as you guys know, we did a presentation about this quite some time ago, and I believe in this format, but maybe you've heard me elsewhere numerous times explain that ultimately the US and Russia would find themselves on the same side of this conflict. And having seen that hypothesis bear fruit in recent weeks, of course, is a cause first for further concern, because you get a certain layer of confirmation of a part of a hypothesis, and then you may make erroneous other hypothetical judgments based upon the cognitive bias, or rather the hypothesis bias. But there's no doubt that the portion of the hypothesis in which the US and Russia have a rapprochement and find themselves in the same interest zone in this conflict was long forecasted. I think we talked about it on this show, in one of these presentations. But I might have been on my live stream show. Anyhow, we do the issue of the mineral rights and what the UK might have been trying to do and may have involved some scheme that involved either or all the above frozen assets, a co-development of precisely similar or in the same things as with what Trump was proposing. What happened with on the Trump side of communications, we got indication that Trump is interested in investing in Russian minerals. So what's very interesting here is that some of those minerals may be in the parts of the Donbass that are internationally recognized as Ukraine, let's say. So that introduces a very, very interesting part of this was Trump trying to basically secure rights to all of a particular, we'd be talking about lithium in one instance, where there's basically 4 areas and 2 of them are in the parts that Russia holds, and 2 of them are in parts that Ukraine holds. But it looked like that Trump could have been trying to angle to have some sort of development rights in all 4 of them. So then that makes him a very kind of neutral arbiter who's invested in both potentially. Very, very interesting. And so what Zelensky somehow was pretending not to understand or hadn't been informed was how this deal would have guaranteed the peace. And when I was trying to do some of the arithmetic around that, I was saying, if the English lose their right to this because the Americans now have it, then the British, then they will somehow have a decreased appetite for war. So because if Trump is showing that he's willing to invest in them or buy them, whether Russia has them or whether Ukraine has them, it doesn't matter to him. That's already what he said, obviously through his actions. Then it only follows, right? It only stands to reason that that's the negotiating tack. And that would have basically created the foundation for peace, because you wouldn't have this very big layer of incentive for the Europeans to continue to pursue this. So that's always been part of their peace plan. That was always their Lugano format. They're still on the war path. So I didn't mean to swallow the lead here, but very clearly they're still on the war path. And that gives us one of several, possibilities about who's in power in Europe. And that would exclude the UK or include the UK in different iterations, for sure. If you speak broadly enough, of course. But my greatest concern at the moment is that the track that Europe is on is a continuation of the same regime that controlled Biden, but they have less control now in this part of the North American continent. So these globalists, and many of them have American passports, others German and French, of course, Israeli, Danish, etc. But it looks like in terms of their ability to of course you can have their investments, these transnational corporations and so forth, but they need to have a state with not only the legal guarantees of backing their deals and a legal system that supports their own property pursuits, but also that a military that they can do things with. So this idea of like a stateless corporation is not exactly true. They always need a host, so to speak. They're a parasite, let's say, that can't survive without one in that sense. So I think there's been a migration, so to speak, of this power network that is bent on war with Russia. And to me, that means that they're trying to articulate a strategy where if they can hold out 6 months or a year, and if they can affect midterm elections in the United States, then maybe they can do something that creates an impeachment crisis or something that forces Trump's hand. They're banking on, they're definitely angling in, they're showing this sort of Hillary Clinton level of resilience, so to speak. So they're chiefly banking on presenting themselves as a credible team for managing the West with a realizable long-term goal. Peter has a question. Before I see the question, I would like to open to questions, and we have like an hour left.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah.
Do you want me to read the question, or do you want to do
I can see the question for
thought?
sure. But I would only just spoken about the conflict in Ukraine and Trump's and Zelensky's sort of diplomatic row, but really then what the long-term strategy is, what provoked Zelensky, what allowed Zelensky, or who sort of compelled Zelensky. Like on the one hand, it's like, wow, kind of looks like just like a cocaine meltdown or whatever. But I believe that his statements about the ceasefire won't work were things that he had committed to say going in. I don't think he was provoked to say the ceasefire won't work. I think he had it in his mind that he was going to have to say that. And he was hoping that the situation and that the things that the British said and the way the press were angling it, because the British were saying, or are still saying, incoherent things, mind you. Starmer is saying, we're preparing to send troops. This way, the ceasefire is enforceable. He's using vague language about the order of events in that. So that's called strategic ambiguity. Macron already admitted to it in the same case, which kind of said the quiet part out loud. But that's the strategic ambiguity, is his destruction of the English language, wherein he says in the first case something which is atemporal in terms of grammar. And then he says, and this won't work without the US support. Well, that does add now some temporality and some order to it, because it's like, so are you going to create the provocation and send the troops? Once they start getting killed, you're going to try to use that to create a political crisis in the US, like, hey, how come you're not supporting the UK? Well, we saw when Starmer and Trump met, Trump shut him down too. Starmer was trying to say, well, the US has always supported the UK in past. The UK has always supported the US in the past. And then Trump goes, yeah, he kind of laughs and he goes, do you think you can take the Russians on by yourself? And he goes, well, no, however, whatever. And he's like, all right, then. So that was the point. This is the very, very, very important takeaway there. But yeah, definitely get your questions or requests for clarifications, or, yeah.
Well, I'd say this, yeah, like if you want to shift gears for some dialogue with the audience, that's cool. And you're right, yeah, Peter got in early with a question, and I'll read it and hear your thoughts. But Peter writes, or actually, Peter, you're there. Do you want to just pose your question in your own words?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, XF. Good to see you again. Live, and we're getting ready for Clean Monday tomorrow, at least on the Gregorian calendar. Here's my question. XF, I find the talk of a European treaty organization to be vacuous. My word. The Western European Union, WEU, existed during the Cold War. Does it still exist? And who benefits from discussion of a purported new military organization without the United States of America? That's my question.
Yeah, the German-based, Deutsche Mark-based Western European Union as a currency union still exists, independent of the UK and the pound, and independent of countries in the European Union that are not part of the euro currency zone. And then there's another layer too. There's countries that are in the euro currency zone whose euro emissions from the authorized hub of let's say central banks in the EU that can emit euros are doing so based upon purchases of, for example, U.S. Treasury bonds, or their value of those. So that's going to be different than from the actual value of the mark itself. So, but you can look, for example, if you want to see what the real value of the German mark is right now compared to the euro, you can just look online at the currency value for the convertible mark from Bosnia, because Bosnia is a colonial project. They're a colony of the EU and NATO, but fiscally it's a German project. So you can see that's the value of the mark right now. If you still had a mark, for example, like in Germany, you could exchange these up to a certain point. They have to destroy them, but you could, settle. You could still buy these, use these until a certain point, and that's the value that they have today. So you can see what happened in 1999 or whatever when the euro was dropped on people's heads. People say they went to the stores and basically prices had doubled. So it was, and these were all people that thought they were smart and voters and conscientious, and they read the newspapers and like, oh, it's going to be the greatest thing to bring the euro out.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Western European Union is, very interesting, but the mission of NATO throughout the Cold War never changed, and it was, as an institution and a way of thinking, not something that is long-term globally sustainable, because it's premised upon balancing Germany's economy such that it doesn't pose certain competitive challenges to other European economies, well, British or American economies, really, within NATO, let's say. Other NATO economies would be more clear. So it was to keep the Americans in, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Germans where? Up? No, down. Keep the Germans down. That's an age-old expression. That's longer than I've been alive. Right? Keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down. That's NATO. So how the relationship now has changed, obviously, because if you have the balance of forces in the world, you can't have an economic order in the West with these levels of disproportionality. In other words, other parts of the world are engaged in large scale investments of infrastructure and are thinking ahead by 50 and 100 years. So if the Western model has been so much oriented towards the financial sector and the services sector, and relying on that exactly same said developing world to serve as the productive basis for it. So, when you put those pieces together in terms of the global architecture, really the policy of balancing Europe and having it in a hostile relationship with Russia was not sustainable, because you go back to the 60s and 70s and you already have European development on Russian resources. And those pipelines for Ukraine were not built like in the 90s. They weren't built by Yeltsin. Like, they were built many decades before that, or several decades before that. So
we got a question. Well, first of all,
Martin is saying, check out his recent Pluralia article on Starmer's 100-year.
Well, he's bringing that up because Monty brought up the how there's a lot of speculation that within this 100-year agreement there were secret arrangements giving mineral rights to the UK. I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Since Marty pointed out he wrote an article on that, did Marty also pick up on this? Well, Marty, you are saying that you did pick up on the idea of enslaving Ukraine and the non-existent rare earth minerals to create a new British empire. So I'd like to get both Joaquin and maybe Marty's thoughts on that.
Mine's
Martin
easy.
first?
So mine's 5 seconds. So I'll just go first because I want to hear what Martin has to say. Listen, it's in the parliament.uk document. They say earth minerals. So it's there.
Exactly.
So it's not, it's beyond speculation.
Exactly.
But I don't know. It doesn't have more details than that. So Martin,
Okay.
it's all yours.
Okay. You guys can hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, fine. Look, Joaquin, you're ahead of me by months and years as usual. And you are too, Monty. I was slow on the uptake on this one. But as I looked at the clearly insane idea of a 100-year alliance between Britain and Ukraine, it makes no sense. Britain cannot afford it. As you and I have agreed privately so often, Matt and others have too, Britain is bankrupt. Where will the money come from? Well, they think they know where the money will come from. It will come from the Third British Empire. America was the first. India and Africa were the second. Well, actually, you could say the Middle East was briefly the fourth. That was all Churchill's folly, and it all collapsed within 40 years. It started in 1914. It was completely gone by 1958. That's actually a study we should look at as a separate issue. Who created Britain's empire? Why in the Middle East? Why did it collapse so soon? But what was it after in the Middle East? It was after raw material. It was after the oil. And what are they after now? They're terrified of Trump. They know the golden age of living off America is over. They themselves slit their own throats. I'm sure everybody here is scathing view of the European Union. But the Slovaks and the Hungarians are showing the way to deal with the European Union. You don't go outside it and let yourself as a small nation be slaughtered at their mercy. You fight them from within. Margaret Thatcher understood this. Her successors did not, but she did very clearly. Farage, again, I completely agree with your assessment of him, Matt, and with our friend Mike's earlier, that Farage is an Anna's. Farage is a demagogue. Farage is also a Pied Piper of destruction. And he's led the British up a garden path. They had this fantasy, and I heard Liz Truss say it in front of me personally when I was covering her in Washington a few years ago, when she was one of the most inept British foreign secretaries in history, before she became an even more disastrous prime minister. And she said it wasn't that she was lying. What was frightening was that she wasn't lying. She really believed that Britain was going to be what they imagined they had been in the 18th century, faster, more agile, more entrepreneurial, more adaptive than anyone else. Well, that's not the way they got their empire. They got their empire by stealing it and bombing peoples who couldn't fight back, and bombarding them and exterminating them. That's how they got their empire, which of course they can't admit. But she believes her own lies. She believes the empire's lies. And of course, now they are exposed. They aren't outperforming the entire European Union. They certainly aren't performing Russia or China or the United States. They're outperforming nobody. They're outperforming nobody. And this is the key to what is happening in Ukraine. And again, bless you, Joaquin, in far more succinct language than I use, you have nailed it. It is very clear. They want Ukraine out of Russia the same way they wanted the Confederacy out of the Union 160 years ago. And this was a serious policy. It was only Nigel Hamilton in his wonderful new book on Lincoln, British turned American historian, wonderful book on Lincoln. He brings out how the Emancipation Declaration, something you, Matt, and Anton, and your friends and colleagues here have known and argued very clearly and coherently for many years, how Lincoln's economic nationalism policy and policies of freedom completely negated British and French imperial plans to splinter the United States and create a new slave empire based on the Confederacy. This is not conspiracy theory. This was spoken explicitly by future Prime Minister, dominant British political figure of the 19th century for 60 years, William Ewart Gladstone, at his speech in Newcastle on Tyne in, I think, September, check the exact date, but certainly in the fall of 1862, before the Emancipation Declaration. Gladstone said, the Confederacy has created an army. It remains to be seen if they have created a nation. His import was very clear. Once we are convinced they have already won the military victories, we are on the verge of preparing our people for recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation, and then we will use the overwhelming sea power of Britain and France to protect the Confederacy and destroy the Union. This was British policy. That it was foiled by two people, by Abraham Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who deployed the Russian Navy to New York City and San Francisco to protect the Union from Britain and France. He was an ally of Lincoln. They became pen pals and close friends by letter for the rest of their lives. History is repeating itself here. The aim of the 100-Year Treaty is to dismember Russia and enslave Ukraine as the next third or fourth British Empire. It is insane. It cannot happen. It will not be allowed to happen. But the elite in London believe it will happen. And they are panic-strickenly overreaching for it because they see no other hope for their own survival ahead. And the British public, swallowing the BBC, are so asleep at the switch, as Mike rightly analyzed, I believe, this morning, that they are going along with it.
It just seems so hard to fathom the logic behind this, since am I wrong to say that the UK views those minerals that are located in Russian territory, like in the Donbass, as part of what they want? Like, how do they possibly presume that that's ever going to happen? I don't get it.
It can happen if Russia is destroyed.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Which the Biden administration deluded itself, and the British too deluded themselves, was going to happen. Now, these things were never going to happen. But as you know, Matt, leaders from Hitler to Winston Churchill in both world wars are adept at deluding themselves that insane policies like Gallipoli, like the invasion of Anzio, like the Nazi invasion of Russia, the ultimate in insanity, these things still happen. Yeah. Most of my personal Russian friends did not believe that Russia would invade Ukraine, even after all the 14,000, 15,000 Russians did. It was clearly going to be a disaster if they did. But the Russian government was so upset and concerned about the rising death toll in Donetsk and Lugansk that they lost their own sense of restraint. And every peaceful attempt over the previous 8 years to peacefully resolve the issue had been blocked by Britain and the United States and France. So that's your answer. It's not a rational policy.
Yeah. That's good.
But
I appreciate the reminder. That's good.
Do irrational things.
Yeah, right. That's good. Thank you. Joaquin, what's your thought or your take?
Let me lower my hand here. Yes. I very much appreciated Martin's insights and the relationship when referencing the period in the Civil War and what the British were trying to do at the time, how they see Ukraine. I want to say about this mineral deal, like maybe we didn't really kind of clarify the significance of what the maneuver that just occurred was, because as we discussed, it was a secret agreement that was made. And even this document from maybe up to a month or so later that says, yes, there was an agreement made a month ago. And even though there are some details about that agreement there, you would need to understand that for that to have been a non-published agreement, that it was also non-published on the Ukrainian side. So on the first read of, for example, why Zelensky would have had apprehension to signing off his country's mineral rights to Trump, let's say, or to the US, for example, would be because well, among the public, it would be seen as he sold the country, right? Like he sold the country. And it also could have been done in such a way to consolidate his position, because the British have also been grooming Zelensky. So there's a very, Trump has the ability to play the card of putting enough pressure on Europe that there's an agreement that Zelensky has to go. But there are reasons why Trump hasn't gone that way. I hope we can tie this all in together in a way that coherently, like, you can understand what's going on. Because the agreement is secret on the Ukrainian side, right? And there's questions about, who, in Zelensky's inner circle knows about this agreement or doesn't know about this agreement, or then they heard that Trump is trying to do it. So then it's kind of like, well, what's their attitude towards that agreement? But they may not know that there's another agreement, right? So anyway, when the issue of these minerals again, and that Trump wants them, becomes an issue that's very public, and then you get into whether part of what we just saw had caused a strategic impasse for Zelensky, where either of his outcomes will work against him, because if he plays it, like one way or the other, he's still going to wind up on the short end of it all. So if he tells the truth about the prior deal was conducted, like, there's going to be people that are telling him you can't conduct the deal, right, because it'll look bad. Then you're going to have people telling him conduct the deal, right? And then you're going to have people telling him don't conduct the deal because you already have a deal with the British, right? Like, that's going to nullify that deal. So what happens when different groups of people who don't want it to happen start to communicate? So people start to find out what really happened. So you have a lot of destabilizing potentials inside of Ukraine based on the outing of what was originally supposed to remain a secret deal, right? So Trump's deal was very public. They turned it into like a whole long, like 50-minute, thing that, people saw what happened. So very important to understand that there's numerous possibilities, but very clearly there was a British deal before, and Zelensky would have liked not to focus on it because it has this very quid pro quo type of thing that Zelensky was trying to avoid. Like, he was trying to avoid it looking like he was giving rights to something in exchange for very little or nothing. And why that 100-year alliance was so criticized, in part, was because, it's impossible to enforce, as Martin said. Well, I think that this agreement contemplates its own impossibility. And so when you when you dig into the language of that agreement or the summary of it, and they answered as kind of a Q&A section, they say, you know, there's no requirement or no part of this that requires, you know, England or the UK or Ukraine to send forces to each other's country. So it's Zelensky really had nothing to show for that agreement either, and yet he gives in that one he also gives the UK tremendous rights to this stuff. So we would imagine, like, but that's secret. But now it's not secret anymore over there among all his inside people because of all the controversy that arose around why he shouldn't sign it, because they ultimately agreed that he shouldn't sign it, is my point. So he went in there basically like deciding that even if it sabotaged the signing, it would be the right thing because he would be able to make it look like it was going to happen. He was hoping to make it look like Trump's fault or whatever, and that his zingers and his arguments and his rhetorical points would like stick in the opposition media or whatever he was hoping. But not to digress from the singular point. Definitely it was planned that he would say his part about there can be no ceasefire. That was going to derail Trump's whole talking point about, that was the whole press conference, because Trump was connecting signing this as part of necessary for a ceasefire to happen. We explained the mechanism there. So this is a very clear sign that now proceeding to a forecast. It's a very clear sign to me from numerous statements unrelated to the specifics of each question. I've heard it from Lavrov. I've heard it from Putin. These are all things that you've heard too, but I document them on my channel. I remember them. 6 months is this period of time that like always keeps coming up, that this conflict will at the very least continue on for. It's very interesting. And Putin said, you know, even if things went well with the US in terms of the process for getting to a format that could produce a peace plan, would be like 6 months. Then you read some articles in Washington Post and New York Times, and they're saying like, oh, like without the US, but just Europe, Ukraine can last another 6 months. I think it's a little more than 6 months, but 6 months is a very interesting time frame to consider. I think more like a year altogether, like maybe that includes normalization all around and a reset in Europe. But yeah, maybe in terms of the conflict, 6 months or more. Anyway, but our forecasts have been generally pretty good. That was the royal we, by the way. That was me, myself, and I. My forecasts have been pretty good overall on this. And especially with US and Russian rapprochement, and that effectively the US would find itself in opposition to Europe and on the same side as Russia. Whether that was declared or not is really irrelevant, you know. Anyway, chat
cool.
Questions.
Yeah, Anna has a bunch of pretty thorough questions and thoughts. I don't know, Anna, would you like to speak your question aloud, or do you want me to just read it? Because there's a lot in there.
I can read the question.
Oh,
Hi, Matt.
Oh, okay. Anna can read it. Yeah.
There you are, Anna.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for not sharing video yet. Yes, I'm actually thinking about this conflict and about the minerals deal. To be honest, what I've heard from specialists, I come from Romania, so I would say that a lot of Romanian people would know quite a few things about the mineral resources in Ukraine. It seems that the last land survey of those minerals was done during USSR. So I'm not sure how accurate that is. And it also seems that they only exploit something worth around 15 billion currently. which doesn't seem to be too much to warrant 500 billion, what Trump expects as return on investment. So I'm not sure if this is simply as an excuse, and there are lots of other nuances and hidden games that are being played in the background, or this is just there's something more that we are not aware of.
Yeah, so very good question. So Zelensky has gotten himself in the business of like selling rights and selling the rights to exploit and to explore and things like this. Very interesting. Well, think about, you said there's like some other layer to this. Well, think about how Trump is drawing all this attention to something that actually Ukraine doesn't have that much of. You see what I'm saying? Like it does have, but half of it of at least one category, just when talking about of its total, mineral and raw material wealth in the country, the lithium is there, but it's not like a huge amount. For example, other rare earth minerals, again, not a huge amount, but yet you can see that Zelensky was nevertheless, broadly there's minerals, there are minerals, but I think that the talking point of rare earth minerals is going to serve a longer term purpose in the narrative in terms of bringing conversations to Europe about these things, because actually, with rare earth minerals, Ukraine has a negligible amount, but Greenland has a good amount. Not as big as places like Brazil, but they have a good amount. It would give the U.S. something in that case. So they're directing a lot of energy around this question, and we'll see. If something happens in the war and it escalates, and Europe gets behind Ukraine, and Ukraine gives Europe like exclusive rights to things, they're gonna go in on that. Trump might respond by taking Greenland and getting actual rare earth from Greenland, while Europe obliterates itself against the Russian army. And then a lot of Ukraine would be something else, and maybe Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia might also become something else. But yeah, a lot of there are so many potential things going on in terms of how the patterns that we identify in the way that Trump makes an issue about one thing and then develops certain themes about how to understand the way that works, and then you can see that in other, either indirectly or directly manifest in some other question, even if it's just to draw attention to the question, because it is very strange that actually in some of these categories, in the particular category of rare earth minerals, Ukraine doesn't have a lot. So it is very weird. It is very weird. Do I see a rift? Part of your question, you said, do I see a rift between Western Europe and Eastern European countries?
Yes, that was one of the questions, because I think Ukraine doesn't have very good relations with any of its neighboring countries. Because the same situation that happened in Donbass with ethnic Russians is the same situation that happened with adjacent areas that were incorporated into Ukraine that used to belong to Romania or Hungary or Poland. And the same type of persecution, ethnic persecution of Romanians or Hungarians, and I think Viktor Orban mentioned that as well several times, has happened with other peoples as well. So let's say, I think the simple existence of Ukraine, establishment of Ukraine in 1991 was sort of a Trojan horse.
Yes, I agree with what you're saying. I would also add to that as well some thoughts. For example, I think that Eastern European countries and Eastern Europe and the Balkans, I would say Eastern Europe and the Balkans, they are tired of Zelensky. Even people like Ukrainians, people like Ukrainians, fine, okay, but they're particularly tired of this regime because they keep creating divisions in their own countries around the question of war in Ukraine. And can you give weapons? And well, that was the taxpayers had bought those originally. The governments didn't buy those, the taxpayers bought those. So people are tired of giving weapons. And then also, the EU is a very difficult deal as it stands for a lot of countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, especially produce grains and wheat. And the deal that over time they've been able to negotiate through Brussels structures on prices and how, it barely works. And they still borrow from the IMF. They still don't exactly break even. The state still has certain subsidies. I mean, it's a mess, but they make it work. Like in 5 years, it'll work or something, but that's it. Maybe they have to do something else in 10 years. But for Ukraine, with the special arrangements, it was like they basically allowed Ukraine into the EU. Even worse, it was almost like they were better than EU. It was like they're talking about let us into the EU, but in certain industries, in particular perishable goods like grain and wheat, they had better than EU access. Like they didn't, there were not the rules that applied to these other countries, Poland, Romania, and so forth. So it's been very difficult for industries, and it's this preposterous attitude that you owe Zelensky, that he's doing something for you that now you owe him, So it's almost like, it feels like a mafia, like a thug thing. It's like, he's like picking fights with people and then pulling you into it and then saying, oh, I'm protecting you from him. It's like, no, fucker, you started this fight. Excuse my French, but you get the idea.
Yeah, actually, that was the question for that was the context for my questions regarding the rift between Western and Eastern Europe. Because obviously, when it comes to Eastern European countries, you see typically these are the dissenters in the European Parliament. You see the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Robert Fico. You see Viktor Orban. Probably the upcoming governmental change in Austria, where the conservatives are getting more and more influence. In Romania, the same thing, and the political prosecution with canceling the elections and all of this witch hunt, similar to Russiagate, I would say.
Very similar. Yeah, I mean, Russiagate worldwide,
Exactly, the European coup. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. But this is where you see the rift. So you see that all of these countries are electing more conservative governments, and in a determined way, because their people feel oppressed. These are poorer countries that have less debt than the Western European countries. Because if we look at these countries that are so keen to go into war, there are countries that have debt to GDP in excess of 120%. So they have no other way to salvage their financial systems but by going to war. And I think that's what Keir Starmer is trying to do with the London Metal Exchange, basically transacting a lot of these rare minerals. That he tries to use those as collateral to sort of pump some blood into the system. But I'm not sure this is a successful strategy. And my question is, how could US intervene in this? Because it's absolutely delusional to believe that Britain or France on their own can attack can face Russia. I mean, as you mentioned, Trump asked Keir Starmer, "Can you take on Russia on your own?" And it was an embarrassing moment where he had to say, "Well, actually, I don't. I have to call my big brother." So the question is, how can US sort of find a way to leverage this rift, to leverage the popular discontent in Eastern European countries, and bring peace by separating West and East, which unfortunately would lead to a similar separation as the one we've had during the Cold War.
Yes, I believe that the process underway right now is one where I would not argue that the continued weakening of Europe is in anyone's interest. However, I can see several plans in which we get out of this mess and eliminate the possibility of World War III, and we see a realignment of different countries, including the relationship between the US and Europe, for example, and point to your question, thank you. How the United States can act, I don't see that it's in their interest at this moment, given their balance of power. So you had a part of the Biden administration had created through the ecosystem of the conflict a method by which Americans can buy up European companies. We'll keep it in simple language. So ultimately, the US is in a process of re-vassalizing and vassalizing the European economy. That process began under the false imaginary possibility that Russia could be destroyed. But that was just the policy in the final analysis. That's just the policy that created this ecosystem. But the ecosystem itself doesn't really care what the reason is that Europe is becoming weak. They don't have to support it or be against it. They just have to act like economic actors and continue to absorb European assets. So I think that as Trump said, the US is going to be happy either way. You see, what that means is that if Europe continues the war, then the US will continue to absorb the functioning parts of the Western European economy and the bankrupt parts. Trump has already shown that he can make mineral and energy deals with Russia now. They're talking about ending sanctions now. Europe is still acting like Biden's the president. So the reality is that the United States and Russia can easily resume normal economic activity. So then Europe could even be facing 25% tariffs on all goods, sold to the United States. So who's actually being sanctioned then? There's just many interesting things to think about with this. So when Trump makes deals, and there was a different power group before him, but those power groups can be divided into other power group interests that can be brought on board because their only interest is in the ecosystem that works out for them in the power dynamic or in the money dynamic. So very clearly, Trump is absorbed that has said, look, this ecosystem, like you can, don't worry that don't get generals to sign a petition saying that you're not going to recognize me as president on January 20th. Like, no, there's a way for this to work too. Like you can continue to buy up European assets or induce European companies to delist from the European Stock Exchange and relist on the New York Stock Exchange. It's a phenomenon we've been seeing for a couple of years. And Europe is paying 1.5 to 2 times the median price for energy for G7 countries. It's unsustainable. So the United States, is able to buy these up. And so why are they buying these up if they're unsustainable? What do you mean? because the United States can make the deals with Russia, and then they can force, once the United States controls enough of these European assets that are worth nothing with European governments that have anti-Russian policies, but once you turn on that clean, beautiful Russian natural gas, it's going to come through, and that's it, you know, and then it's going to make all of those things profitable again like they were before the sanctions, except there's been an ownership change. And that's the main strategy underway.
Yeah. We had Uwe. Oh, and by the way, I wrote this down and I really appreciated this. And I noticed Nikki also had to reemphasize this. Europe is acting like Biden is still president. I just think that that simple statement is hilarious and very insightful. Like that is animating all of their calculus and behavior and everything. It really gets at the heart of it. I think a lot of the incompetence there. So I appreciate that. Uwe had a question. Uwe, you're over in Germany, so it's, I know, a little bit late for you as well. You want to just put it into your own words?
Yeah, well, so forgive me. As I said, I'm not very up to speed with all those strategic considerations which Joaquin and you all have been dealing with for a very long time, and I'm an amateur. But the question is, my understanding from following you and the Rising Tide Foundation and a lot of other sources is that Wall Street is a British bridgehead within U.S. policy. If this is true, what is the relevance of this British bridgehead within U.S. policy today with regards to Europe, where you have mentioned Poland and Romania, for example, of being sort of satrapies or operation grounds for possible actions against Russia. What about Germany, which is going to have a BlackRock affiliated chancellor very probably very soon? What role does this play in all of this?
Yeah, no, it's an important question and not one that I have a full answer to, honestly, but also the Goldman Sachs operations, right? Like look at Mario Draghi and all of Mark Carney. Like these are all groomed like technocrats who are clearly of an ideological view. And I'm very curious to get Joaquin's views on this too, but I'm just going to share some considerations I have. You've got all of these Goldman Sachs figures embedded in very high levels of political influence all across Europe. And you could say, well, are they thus instruments of Wall Street in Europe? And it's like, well, there's, I think, games within games in some ways, the way I look about it, because they're not animated by any of this. Like 95% of the people who work within Wall Street or the City of London are stupid people. Like they really believe in the idea of making money with money. They believe in the casino logic. They're not necessarily super bright individuals, but then you have clubs within clubs where those in the know, those initiates, are allowed to understand that this is a game, that most people are expendable, including those who think that they're playing the game, but they're not. They're being played. And people like Draghi are clearly ideologically, they don't believe in neoliberalism, though they were very good at mastering the rules of it, or Mark Carney, you know, a Goldman Sachs investment banker. But they know that this is a tool for an end which isn't making money. It's the purpose of that tool of the neoliberal order was to destroy and weaken the nation state system and move the wealth and the powers of production and everything else to the hands of a very small clique, with the ultimate objective of blowing out the very system that maybe made them or their clientele a lot of money, but it was always a temporary thing, a means to an end. So you got that factor in it, of these misanthropic Malthusians who have been preparing the groundwork for the new system that would be reset, and that goes back decades. They've known that. But then as far as the nuance of like how strategic or tactically that's playing out now, that's a big discussion, because it seems like you do have figures within the banking community and within the business community who recognize that it's not in their advantage to necessarily blow out the system that made them the billions, and that are trying, or even to unleash nuclear war on the world, which will wipe out any ability they would have to continue to exist. And so that's, it seems like the way I'm looking at it is you have factions battling within the oligarchy. There's fissures and a non-agreement over what would be the best pathway to navigate this, where certain forces within the US seem to be tapping into an idea of retooling their industrial belts and resetting like to a pro-industrial paradigm around the MAGA crowd. Other ones are still committed to the old script. And the way I'm looking at it is kind of like the factions within England that were battling over whether they would continue with the Hitler program that they put decades into building up as a sort of post-nation state, New World Order fascist program, versus those that said, no, we don't want to take that risk. It doesn't fit our idea what our self-interest is. And they fought to abort the Hitler program to live to fight another day. Doesn't mean that they were good, but I sort of see a parallel in some of these groups today. But I don't know. And then you got the whole transhumanist thing too, which has its own agenda, which is not necessarily inclined to even make money, or they've got a whole other thing going that's more religious. But I don't know. It's something which I'm still trying to wrap my mind around, some of the nuances and complexity, because you're right, it is paradoxical on many levels. But I'd be curious to get Joaquin or but Joaquin and Marty's take on it.
Yeah, I think that in answer to the question that I understood, it's always difficult it's a multi-pronged question, and the only way to answer it, directly or succinctly is for that to be premised upon some other conclusions about how the world works that have been made before. And I would hate to present my idea as if those other foundational components were presumptions instead of conclusions from prior investigations. But in short, then with that said, as a sort of proviso, the Germany, the BlackRock Vanguard is hedging their bets, and they were able to get a lot through the Biden administration in terms of guarantees in Ukraine. And generally speaking, they, in some limited wisdom, contained most of those investments to areas not in the Lugansk and Donetsk and Crimea and so forth. So we're talking about agricultural land in Dnipropetrovsk region and so forth. So, and other minerals interest in there as well. So there was some idea that, even if in the worst case scenario, you have to get to a ceasefire and we don't remove the Russians from those breakaway republics, then you have basically this transfer of rights to wealth in different iterations from Ukraine or different Ukrainian oligarchs to the American oligarchs. Well, there's been fighting inside this oligarchy, as Matt was saying, and the group that was pushing for hostilities with Russia has lost power in the United States, but they still have power in a lot of parts of Europe. And so it makes sense that Vanguard BlackRock would, at least have a good candidate to lead one of the main countries in Europe as a way to justify their official version of their level of confidence in the investment, and insofar as that plays a role in investors' portfolios. So they're obviously going to try to do things that would be like improving their ability to talk their book. So that's rather clear to me. But what that means in terms of the future of this war and Germany is that Germany will continue to support Ukraine in this war for another 6 to 8 months. And then that will lead to, there will be a very big problem with the euro, because the relations with the US will be bad, and there's going to be a very big slowdown on sales to the United States from Europe. And maybe, or the threat of those will be used to settle something else. But the idea that the United States feels the need to stop Europe from its destructive course, there's no reason for me to believe that the United States needs to stop Europe from its present course. I think another 6 or 8 months and everything will be ripe enough. And then you'll have peace, maybe a year. But again, it's going to be a huge transfer in power of Western Europe to American oligarchs, and there's going to be a depowering of German and French and etc. oligarchs, and then for those interests to be profitable again, they're going to reconnect Nord Stream 2. They're going to turn on all the gas. They're going to end all the sanctions. And I think that will be what happens. Europe could decide not to do that, but I don't know where the political will come from, because the United States can support the anti-war populism in Europe, and they can support the pro-war Atlanticists in Europe, because their short to medium term outcome they're gonna be happy either way, as Trump said to Zelensky. So that's my sense of things.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's something that it's very nuanced, and yeah. I'd be curious, Marty, did you have a thought on that same question that Uwe posed regarding the BlackRock, Vanguard, Western, Wall Street banker influence in Europe, and if that's a beachhead for the British Empire or the City of London influencers into the U.S. politics, then how does that play into what's happening now? But I appreciate what you said, Joaquin, is pretty on point.
I can't speak with authority on this for the same reason Joaquin rightly pointed out. There's so much that is opaque to us, that is inevitably opaque. People, as you know, and you're a leader in this yourself, Matt, people since Anthony Sutton have been trying to disentangle the roles of London and New York finance in dealing with the Nazis and the enemies of the Nazis and the Soviets from the 1920s onwards in Europe. It's an immensely complex topic. What is very clear is that the City of London interest is extremely strong. They, with Starmer with them, are betting to an extraordinary degree on Ukraine, and that Russia will still collapse. The rare earth conundrum is central to this. Many people have pointed out, the US government's own geological surveys confirm there are virtually no rare earth minerals in Ukraine itself, none whatsoever. But, as Colonel Doug McGregor has pointed out, there are very major rare earth deposits in Lugansk and Donetsk, and even some in Crimea. But the only way these could be accessed by a Ukrainian government and by the British behind them is if Russia collapsed. Are they still gambling on this? I think their policy can only make sense in one very dark way. If they are playing for time, as Joaquin and other analysts here very convincingly, and to me very convincingly, argue that they are, this can only buy them a few months at the most. as long as the president and the vice president and the secretary of state, who is also in the presidential line of succession, are still alive. So protecting the president and the vice president and the secretary of state and Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence, which incidentally is a much more prestigious and powerless post. I would have preferred to see her as secretary of defense or head of the CIA directly, because the DNI position is a coordinating position. It does not have the direct power that ordinarily you need to exert direct control over the agency or any other of the major intelligence assets. The British operate with impunity in the United States. They have done so since the days of William Stevenson, which I know you, Matt, are extremely familiar with, back in 1939, 1940. And Colonel Doug McGregor warns openly on his podcast, which is watched by up to 500,000 people, that the Ukrainian Secret Service has been operating in Northern Virginia with an easy reach of Washington and the White House and the Pentagon. And under the protection of the CIA, they have been operating with impunity under the Biden administration and since before it. Now, this is an extremely dangerous situation. Can the president even be sure of the reliability of the Secret Service that is there to protect him? They were culpably guilty under Jill Biden's incompetent choice as head of the Secret Service for 4 years. But is it only the head of the Secret Service, who has since been removed, who needs to be replaced? Have all the other agents been vetted for loyalty and reliability in protecting President Trump and Vice President Vance? We do not know. Yeah. If anyone serious is monitoring this broadcast, I hope they take these patriotic concerns, these genuine patriotic concerns, under control. Because I learned something from my father, who was an Irish military intelligence officer in neutral Ireland in World War II, and who was a friend of senior police officers in Northern Ireland through much of the Troubles. Simply because he was fascinated by police. He would have been a policeman, a detective under other circumstances, and he just loved the way they thought, and he hung out with them. But what I learned from him was you have to think the unthinkable if you're going to solve crimes, and if you're going to prevent crimes and deter them. And I think in America here, maybe you're more sophisticated in Canada. I hope you are. But in the US, and certainly in Britain, much more even than we are, people are vastly too trusting and innocent. Yeah. If people believe the BBC, if people believe the New York Times and the Washington Post and public broadcasting and CBS and CNN, and they do, you can get away with anything. They got away with the Kennedy assassination because it was inconceivable to the entire American people that the American government itself could be heavily implicated in the assassination. And of course, it totally was. Head of the FBI, vice president, and successor president himself. The mastermind of it, a figure much more powerful and senior than Lyndon Johnson. We know who it was. No secret now. Alan Dulles. But this was inconceivable to people 60 years ago. Inconceivable, except to Colonel Fletcher Prouty. And this is still their secret strength here. So yes, the British do have leverage in America. They certainly have some in Wall Street, but that's not the key issue. The key issue is the City of London and the British government's existential panic of being cut off by America. That's the key issue. Yeah. Ever since Churchill's day, for 80 years, Britain has survived by either manipulating the American government or, when it can't, hanging nervously onto the American government. And I'll just say once more, as I said in another broadcast recently, and that is 30 years ago, a senior advisor to Mrs. Thatcher said to me that the grand strategy of the British government was to play Tonto to America's Lone Ranger. That's still their policy.
Right. Always valuable. Thank you, Marty. We got 11 minutes before I have to do a hard stop. So Sam had a good question, and I definitely want to get your thoughts on Romania. Colin Georgescu just gotten arrested a few days ago. They let him out, but I mean, still with strings attached. Also, I think within that, I would also ask if you can say a word or two about Milorad Dodik, and the fact that there's now I don't know if it's a warrant, but I mean that he's supposed to face a year in prison according to the desires of the EU High Representative from Germany. So could you say a word about those two cases maybe and give your take on that?
Yeah, so I guess we're just looking at the Balkans in brief in 5 minutes, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the crisis, they had threatened that they would do this with the German election, what happened, and maybe they did in some way, who knows about the outcome of the German election, but they definitely played with the process of the Romanian election in the courts. So with the way that they decided all of a sudden to arrest him on these other charges, it was really bizarre. And then his release later the same day, after people began to take to the streets. And I suspect also perhaps some diplomacy from the United States, because this had been precisely the subject of the words of J.D. Vance to the Munich forum. He specifically talked about this case. So I think there's very strong likelihood that this fits in, the story here fits into the broad charm offensive that the United States was conducting leading up to and ongoing with the talks with the Russians, from the destruction of USAID, NED, to cleaning out, to putting new people in charge of the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, the CIA, FBI, Kash Patel. You've got just a new State Department, everything. So it's been really a sea change in terms of the US approach, and they came bearing as many gifts as possible that cost nothing to do and gain you so much sense of simpatico, from your interlocutor, from the Russian side. And I think that very well, like, we could see some action on this. Like, I think that the United States could even put enough pressure on Romania that we can actually see Colin Georgescu, and this would be as Romania's next leader. But after this impasse, there's going to still be some more crisis to unfold. But I believe in the midterm, he will prevail, because he has connections with both sides, and he is the leader. He is a leader that represents the trend in front of us, which is you're going to have investment and support from both Russia and the United States. So that's a good segue then to Dodik and also Serbia, Vučić, very similar. So you guys may have heard that the EU basically successfully convicted the leader of the recognized by the EU part of Bosnia, called Republika Srpska, and he's recognized as the premier of that autonomous republic within Bosnia-Herzegovina. And as we've discussed on this show, when we've done, I think, like a Balkans geopolitical roundup, Matt, yeah, like these are all the things that we forecasted. These are all the mechanisms that we talked about, that there's going to be court stuff that challenges the legitimacy of Republika Srpska to be an autonomous republic within Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's what happened. Here we are now, and they've taken it to the point of lawfare, where he himself, has been charged and convicted. So in answer to the question about if there's a warrant or what, first of all, the trial was conducted with him in absentia. So he's already, in a sense, in defiance of the court, and part of the charges and that he's convicted of is defiance of the court. Now, the court is illegal, and it was a special session, so I don't know about the full scope of the Constitution or his appellate rights, but in theory they are there. And in press, I have read about him exploring exercising his appellate rights, that if there's a window to answer whatever before some type of warrant for arrest comes into play, then that would be the appellate process. However, for folks who just need to, I guess, understand is that they have already closed the border or created brought back to life the border between Republika Srpska and the Muslim Croat Federation, Bosnia Herzegovina. So the Republika Srpska side has its own paramilitary security forces. So there's not a police, there's not a police or military that has the enforcement or would be on their turf to arrest Dodik, because he's the leader of a country that has its own little security forces. So but I believe that there will be some appellate process, but that could be short or that could be long. But all of these things are tying in to, obviously, the big story is what will happen in the outcome of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And people that are thinking in terms of both the United States and Russia having more in common than with Ukraine and Europe, they're the ones that are going to be making decisions and making the deals for the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. This is you've given a lot to think about, and you've answered a lot of questions and ambiguities that have been floating in my mind. So I do appreciate this. And for anybody who is not yet subscribed to Joaquin's New Resistance Telegram channel, I highly recommend you do so now. I think everybody in this particular live meeting is already on board, but for anybody watching on YouTube, check the links in the description box and get on that. Joaquin does every couple of days, or even every day, I think. Yeah, every day, am I right about it?
It's about 3-4 days a week on average, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a pretty consistent output of live briefings to a live audience on that Telegram channel. So check it out. I certainly do. Joaquin, thank you so much. Thank you also, Marty, and thank you everybody else for contributing. And next week, we're going to have, I believe, Kyle Holmes, who's going to be going into some Abraham Lincoln's fight for the greenbacks, some other international dynamics of the 1860s, 70s. So that'll be fun. And then Marty is going to do something the week after that. So we got a good little wave of idea bombs coming at us, and curious to see how this thing unfolds over the coming weeks too. So thank you, and thank you, everybody. Bye.
Ciao.